Yep.
Final news topic of the week, not especially industry related news, but certainly personal news for John and Oliver, both of whom have updated their displays. John, you've gone OLED. Oliver, you
Of course.
haven't.
Yeah.
Who should we start with here? John, let's talk us through your display upgrade, what you've bought, why, and whether you're happy with it.
Right. So I went with the LG G4 OLED. And part of the reason to go for this one was, well, one, I wanted to up the size a bit. So I went from 65 to 77 inch, I think, which is the same size that you have,
Yeah,
Rich.
good man.
77 is a good size, I gotta say. Like, it's even in this relatively small space, it's just very immersive. It's excellent. I like that a lot. And the G4 to me felt like it was like the right time for a nice upgrade, because this is the second year of the micro lens array panels, the MLA layered panels
Yeah.
that LG produced, which does allow a much higher level of brightness, especially in HDR, but also LG's SDR presentation can also, if you want, you can make it very bright, brighter than the competing OLEDs, actually, just in terms of the settings available. And yeah, so I gave that a shot. At the same time, I'm coming from an LG CX, so I knew I was going to have to give up a couple things. And those things, it's primarily the black frame insertion stuff. You lose 120 hertz black frame insertion, and the BFI implementation as it is, it's not as perfect as it was on the CX, where the CX basically eliminated all blur. It was perfect, but the expense was the picture became quite dim. It's so dim in that mode. I was able to stand it, but I suspect if Oliver looked at it, he would just say, "Is the TV even on?" Like, it was that kind of brightness loss, but I love that clarity. The G4 now is such that the black frame insertion is still very good, but because it's a much brighter panel, it now achieves the same brightness basically with BFI on as I got with the CX with black frame insertion off. So it's significantly brighter in that sense. However, it's a case that I'm more about a dark room, deep black levels. So I appreciate the brightness for HDR highlights and such. But for the normal viewing, I actually it's now so bright where I don't want to run it maxed out as I did on the CX. So it's good to have a little headroom there. But there's more to it than that, I would say. Like, it's just the general, like, the interface has been updated. There's more options now. It's easier to get the 444 chroma stuff. They've got the 444 chroma pass through. In addition, because before you had to specifically set your input to PC mode, which also lost you some other stuff. And there's now ways around that. It also solved a lot of the little gremlins I was having with HDMI, so I use a Marantz Cinema 40 AVR now, and I'm very happy with it. But every AVR I've used it, including this one, with the CX, there was times where, like, especially on PlayStation 5, when it would switch to VRR mode, for instance, you would hear sound, but the screen would just be black. And if you check the input, it would say, oh, it's receiving a picture, but there's no image. To fix it, I would literally just have to change the input on the TV to a different input, then change back, and then you get a picture. There's a lot of weird little things like that, specifically with HDMI 2.1 features, where it would just blank out or take too long to switch, or there would be like glitches. And it did annoy me a lot. With this new G4, however, combined with the Cinema 40, all of those issues are gone. So it just, not only that, it switches faster. Like, when it toggles between modes, it's very quick now. It feels less jarring than it used to. And I've not had a single like weird dropout black screen or anything kind of like that when moving between machines, which it's a small thing, but I do like that. I appreciate that a lot.
Cool.
So that's cool.
Any
Um,
downsides?
Downsides, I mean, besides the change in black frame insertion, I did have a weird software bug once where VRR was reported to be working, but it wasn't. Like, it looked visibly juddered, which was
Right.
strange, even though it was reading VRR correctly. But that was fixed by just powering it off and back on. So, being that it's a brand new set, it seems like it's a minor software bug. And as we know, LG is very good about updating their sets. Like, they're still updating the CX. I just had a new firmware not so long ago. So,
Yeah.
I have no doubts that they'll fix those little gremlins for sure. I guess the main thing really is though, it's like for those, like I'm not after the extreme brightness, but the brightness level here is extremely high for me. And I'm very pleased with that, especially for HDR. It means that I've been able to enjoy HDR using HGIG now more than before. Because HGIG is better for proper, like it means the display is not going to mess around with the tone mapping and you get a really nice full range. But on the CX, I would often use dynamic tone mapping
Right.
to sort of amp up the brightness, but it did kind of flatten it a little bit. Like it looks super vibrant, but you didn't get the darks and the lights were closer together, so to speak. But now I feel like the panel's bright enough where you don't need to worry about that. It also means Dolby Vision looks significantly better now. It's very, very intense and vibrant, which I like in just the right way. Films are very immersive at this size as well. So all good stuff there. So I'm really happy with it so far. I think it's the logical step for them. But unfortunately, I don't think it's bright enough for Oliver's eyes, who demands. He is the opposite of me. I play in darker rooms. I like deep black levels, and I don't like searing brightness all the time. But
Well,
Oliver loves his searing brightness.
let's talk about your display upgrade journey, Oliver, because
It's a
Yes,
journey.
it's interesting.
I've heard some interesting tidbits. For example, you buying 3 different displays, but talk us through it.
Yeah, so it starts. It's a bit of a story. It starts in 2021. No, I had I bought a Samsung Q70A mostly for DF work because it supported 120 hertz, 4K, necessary at the time. It was a decent TV, but no local dimming. It was a VA LCD, so I had that for a while. But I was keeping an eye on the TVs that came out this year, especially the OLEDs, and I decided to get an OLED actually, a Samsung S95D, which is the highest end OLED in Samsung's line. It's sort of comparable roughly in terms of positioning to the Sony A95L or indeed the LG G4. So I booted it up immediately, like a great HDR picture, playing games like Dirt 5 and Dead Space. Really great looking, beautiful contrast. It's so crisp. The highlights are so well controlled. Looks awesome. And in SDR, it's mostly acceptably bright, although in like very bright content, you get that ABL, which I really don't like.
Right.
So you get like the automatic brightness limiting. It really dims the picture in bright content. But then I move on to 4K 120 content. Booted up Ratchet and Clank in the 40 FPS mode, and the game is tearing for some reason.
What?
The game is tearing.
Yeah.
It's tearing and it's super jittery. And I'm outputting 4K 120 with VRR. I switched VRR off. It's still doing this tearing. Shut down the console, restart everything, and the game is only doing 1080p 120, even though I have the bandwidth necessary for 4K 120. I have everything set up for 4K 120. It's not working. I move over to the Xbox Series X. 4K 120 in the menus is running fine, but anytime I boot up a game, basically there's that splash screen, that 2D image, and then right after the splash screen, I just lose the image. The game is still connected, the console's still running, but I lose the image. So I try a million things. Some things seem to get it to work intermittently, but it doesn't work for very long in any case. So I suspect the problem here is the One Connect box, in my opinion. There were some issues with it last year. I think I had a bum unit, basically. It's essentially an external box that you connect power and HDMI into, and it connects through one cable to the television. There were some issues last year. I haven't seen any reports of issues like mine this year. Technically, the One Connect box only supports HDMI 2.1 at 48 gigabits per second, or rather 40 gigabits per second, and not 48. But that shouldn't cause any issues with the consoles because the PS5 only maxes out at 32, Xbox only at 40. So it shouldn't be any issue. So anyways, I just decide that, okay, this is not going to work out for me because what if I'm covering a game and I have to double check and I'm going to be, if I have a display issue with the game, I might think it's a problem with the game. It's a problem with my television, even if I do get this sorted out. So I said it's just not worth the hassle and the anxiety about, is this a problem with the game? Is it a problem with my television? It just seemed like a huge hassle. Plus, I'd probably be, months and months trying to troubleshoot this issue. So I just get a Samsung S90D, which is very similar. It's a little bit less bright. Looks good and it works well. I've returned the S95D by this point, obviously, so I have the money for it. Looks good, but it's a little bit dim, especially in SDR content where you don't get that peak brightness. It reminded me actually a little bit of my LG C8. I had an LG C8 back in the day. It's brighter than that panel, but it's still dimmer than I'd like. The ABL is still pretty not great. So I decided to return that. I've decided at this point that OLEDs are not quite for me. And this is where we get the television I did end up buying. So I ended up getting a Samsung QN90D, which is one of the higher end LCD models that has, very good variable dimming and all this stuff. I plug it in and there are no issues with it pretty much from the start. I'm struck by how bright the panel is. It does up to, I think, about 2,000 nits it's been rated at.
Ooh.
In highlight areas of the screen. So in a 10% or 25% window, it's about 2,000 nits. In all white content, it's still 800 or 900 nits. So it does have some ABL, but it's really not an intrusive level of ABL in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's very satisfying. The HDR presentation does have some flaws. It's definitely not as well controlled as you get from an OLED because it has, probably hundreds of dimming zones as opposed to effectively 8.3 million dimming zones in the OLEDs. The bright highlights are sometimes a little bit dimmer than ideal to minimize blooming, I think, and you end up with some blooming and dark content, which you can notice. But there's minimal ABL in bright scenes. That looks really good. And a game in some games, it really does make a big difference. Like in Dragon's Dogma 2, for instance, in that game's HDR presentation, I noticed on my OLEDs, it was really struggling because of the ABL in bright scenes. But on this one, it's actually quite a bright panel, even in those bright scenes. So yeah, I'm really satisfied with the panel. I think it's a good panel. I'm not actually sure if it's an IPS LCD or a VA LCD. I don't think that's been reported yet. It didn't have really nasty smearing to it like a VA LCD typically would, and it has very good viewing angles, so I'm presuming it might be an IPS LCD. But with that local dimming feature, the black levels are, in most content where you don't get blooming, the black levels are about as good as you could expect from an OLED. It's, the contrast ratio is probably 100,000 or 200,000 to 1, judging from prior models. So it's a very good TV, and I'm very satisfied with it so far. And I just think that for me personally, I am in bright rooms mostly. I really don't like ABL. I really like bright panels. I keep this television, even though it is very bright, I mostly run it at max brightness even still. So I just think that OLEDs are not quite for me. And I think that probably there are some people who, like me, just like really bright panels with a lot of vibe and contrast to them. And actually this panel is sort of fun because even in SDR content, you still get all that nice brightness to it. So you can actually run SDR content with HDR style brightness, and it actually looks quite good in some instances. Sometimes it doesn't look so good, but often it does look quite good. So it's a very fun and poppy panel to show someone, and people, when they see it, they're very stimulated by it. It's quite a overwhelming image in a way that I was not getting from the OLEDs. So it's sort of a bit of a difference in taste. I think the OLED technology is ultimately probably a superior display technology, but in terms of achieving that really bright and exciting image in all viewing scenarios, you really can't beat an LCD in my opinion.
Oh, okay. Two different needs.
No, that's so interesting. And when I hear that, I am glad, in fact, that they make LCD still, because it does suit that purpose still. And I do agree that I've traditionally not been a fan of LCDs, but the current ones are quite good. They've come a long way. My bigger issue has always been LCDs in the PC market, because those are just dire in terms of black level quality, and they typically don't do local dimming or anything like that. So when you have local dimming that works properly in game mode and there's enough zones, LCDs can look pretty good. I mean, the closest, the Shogun 7 that I use, by the way, they updated the firmware some years ago, 5 years ago actually, but that thing goes up to 3,000 nits, but it's a 7-inch, it's a portable recording device. But if you allow it to run at full brightness, not only does the unit become almost too hot to touch, the screen is searingly bright. It's actually kind of painful to look at. But I don't think it's meant to be used for viewing content.
Fair enough. Okay, good stuff. Well, there we go.
That's fun. No, that's really interesting. Two very different perspectives on this stuff.
Yeah, I definitely walked into this whole thing expecting to end up with an OLED, but I just think the ABL is something that does get to, I think most people are not really bothered too much by it. But for me in particular, it was just like, yeah, I really just want a panel
Well,
that can do something quite bright.
so the way I run it pretty bright, even in SDR for the OLED bright, but I have it tuned just a little bit down, and the G4 doesn't really have much of a visible ABL dip anymore. So even when you throw up a full white screen, it retains the brightness pretty well. You don't notice it dip. The CX had a very aggressive ABL. You would notice for that. But not so much with the G4. But I'll have to try cranking it all the way to the max. The main reason I stuck with LG though over everything else is just because LG is really good with support for like weird input resolutions and refresh rates. So like stuff coming from like the upscalers, like the RetroTink 4K and such, where you can feed in, like you can output original refresh rates and strange things like that a lot of TVs just do not like, and they get all weird and won't accept the signal. And LGs are really good about accepting just like oddball resolutions without issue. And that's one of the reasons I've kind of stuck with them, actually. Is just you can feed whatever you want to it and it usually works.